Futurism is kind of this concept around art in science fiction and to a degree of what possibilities might be, whereas futurology is more of a scientific approach to understanding trends and looking at patterns that are emerging.
Hey team, welcome to Please Blow My Mind with me, Will Fleming. You will see that we are, and you will hear that we are on the road. And what does that mean? It means the mobile podcast the mobile podcast van studio, version 2 of the caravan studio, is up and going. What does that mean? It means I can now bring you content mobile. And it's very exciting for me because there are less barriers to getting these conversations online, and that pumps me up so much. The fact that I can now go to guests, that I can facilitate conversations on the road, and that's been my dream with this podcast, to blow my mind. And now I don't have to do it from one central location. I can be blowing my mind all over the place. So I want to thank you all for joining me, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening via iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. It is awesome, and I've been experimenting with this podcast, going live with it, just going straight into content, doing intros. So if you've been around for a while, you'll feel the experimentation. And there's two ways to think about that. There's the one way, which is you just keep changing it up for change's sake. But the way I think about it is you're kind of learning lessons as you go, and then bringing those lessons into what you're doing and tinkering. I'm kind of a believer at the moment of just tinkering. I guess the confusing bit is you may be tinkering with things that you don't enjoy maybe, and what I've realized over the last couple of years is I really enjoy this medium of podcasting, of conversations. It's become really evident that talking out loud is an essential, not a must, an essential, or not an option. It's an essential. You have to talk out loud. We can't solve anything through keyboards, through text messages. It's got to be a connection. And so I'm an advocate for talking out loud, for having conversations with people. And that's my dream on this podcast, to talk to 1,000 people. Talk to 1,000 people about life. Ask them what's up, what's down, what's left, what's right, what's the grey area in between the black and white. That's what I want to know. And maybe there's no answers to that stuff, but I will enjoy the journey. I will network with people. I will learn new perspectives. I will blow my mind on several occasions. So very pumped that we get to do this. Feeling very inspired, feeling very mobile. I'm actually on the road at the moment, which is epic. This week's podcast is with my new friend, Huw Jones. And Huw and I met online, which is how a lot of conversations start these days. How'd you meet? Online. But we quickly realized that we caught up for a coffee, and we quickly realized that, this is cool. You get to kind of scope people out on the internet and then reach out and take a punt that person and you might click, and we clicked, and we talked about our similarities with mixed cultures. We talked about our similarities with thinking about life itself and what is consciousness. We actually, after a couple times catching up, decided that we would start a podcast. So sometime in the future, we're already pre-recording now, but we want to kind of release it with a bit of a boom. We will be releasing our podcast called Cultivating Consciousness, which gives me a buzz that two kind of, Pacific Island dudes are going deep into the mind. I think it's timely, I think it's needed, and I think we are going to do it. So stand by for Cultivating Consciousness with me, Will, and Huw Jones. Okay, in this episode though, Huw and I catch up on my podcast, this podcast, Please Blow My Mind. Huw talks about his story, his cultural makeup, very fascinated with how we both have this mixture in culture, and the perspective that having a blurred line, not a fixed line, gives you. So we dive deep into that. Huw talks about his role in business and how he's had to learn some pretty tough lessons, taking a punt on a few things. And I guess the best thing is it's not over. We're only at the start of this game, right? So we should all be mindful that just because we're listening to these podcasts and thinking of our own stories, the game is not over. We're playing, and that's a good thing, because we all know how games work. you have the potential to win right up to the last minute. And that's a very nice feeling for me. Okay, Tim, I think that's enough of an intro. I want to thank you all again for joining me on this podcast. I want to thank Huw Jones for joining me on this podcast. And let's get into it and blow our minds. What an awesome day where we can sit back, listen in, and blow our minds.
We live in a world that encourages us to remove ourselves from the human experience, whether it's looking at our phones too long, forgetting how to talk to someone face to face, or just straight up giving in and convincing ourselves that a chicken nugget is actual food.
It's not food, it's violence.
I don't know about you, but this freaks me out. So I've started a podcast, my antidote to this silliness. It's time to blow our minds. My name is Will Fleming. Welcome to my podcast, Please Blow My Mind. All right, ready to go?
Well, let's do this, bro. All right.
So, Huw, welcome to. You've officially been kidnapped. This is my version of those kidnap videos where it kind of feels like that. We're in a car park. I had this idea of us at the top of a mountain with a nice background, but we're in a kind of car park and it's a bit dodgy, but this is an experience, brother. So
sure
welcome
is.
to the podcast.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, bro.
So I kind of asked you today and to, like if you could, we did it via LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And I was like, what's your bio? How do you explain who you are? And I think that's an interesting exercise.
Sure.
Because very rarely in life are we asked to explain who we are. And when we do, we have to, you take into that baggage and you start getting nervous. And it's almost like we should be practicing saying who we are every day and then not even worrying about other people,
Right.
just who we are. So I challenge you a little bit again.
Sure.
If you had to describe who you are, because, there's one thing for the bio and there's another thing for how we perceive ourselves, and that's kind of how we connected anyway.
Right.
What's your, as of today, how would you describe who you are and what you do?
Very interesting question, bro. As you rightly said, we should all be able to kind of wheel that one off quite quickly, right? But who am I? If I kind of take the most obvious thing to me in terms of how I would describe who I am, I'd draw back on sort of my ethnic background and sort of talk about my family. So my whānau, I'm from Te Aroa. So on my dad's side, I'm part Māori and Welsh. He ended up with a name like Huw Jones, so I'm having a grandfather who was born in Swansea. Yep. And my nan is from Te Aroa, down at Rotorua. We also have ties to Tainui and Waikato. And then on my mum's side, we're part Samoan and Tongan. So we have quite a mix of culture, and particularly from the Polynesian and Celtic roots. On top of that, I'm married. I have a beautiful Samoan princess as my wife.
Cool.
I'm very lucky to have her. Her name is Elizabeth, and she's from West Auckland. So who am I? I'm part Māori, Samoan, Tongan, and Welsh. From an ethnic background, and in terms of I guess what I do, I work as an entrepreneur. I've been involved in a number of startups the last 15 years, and often sort of get weird looks when I say to people 15 years. They kind of look at me like, but you only look like you're about 20, mate. You start when you were like 5, is it? No, actually, a long time ago, long story, try and make this one quite quick, but I got involved in startups at the end of university. I was studying down in Waikato with my old man, and he had this idea come to him in a dream. And we come from a really small town called Tokoro, and there's not really any parking problems there, but it's quite ironic that we're in the middle of a car park talking about parking ideas. But an idea came to him in a dream in which he had this vision of an automated parking technology. So he sort of gathered a few people together, including our friends of whānau, and we went out there to start a company called Huw Developments at the time. And it was basically around optimizing space for property developers and investors to make, I guess, firstly to optimize the space that they had, but and more importantly was also around having this I guess this piece of technology which could make a huge impact in our environment.
So interesting that you're talking about space, because that's the one thing we're lacking at the moment. I don't know if it comes across in the video, probably does, but for those listening, we're like literally in my podcast van. It's the first time we've done this.
Yep.
I asked Huw along because, you know, I thought it'd be nice to have a friendly face in here while I test this out, and we're in the parking lot, and you mentioned parking, and it's funny because there's a possibility we'll get booted out, but you know, like authenticity, we'll leave it all in the podcast.
Sure.
And it can become its own thing. Wow, okay, so that's interesting what you're talking about. Your old man had like this dream. I mean, how did he tell you about that? What did he say to you to pitch you the idea of a dream?
Well, I was actually, I think it was around February, so it was just before we were getting ready to go back to uni back around 2004. 2004, I recall. And so I was at home during the summer break, and I was basically waking up in the morning, and my dad came over to me and he showed me this piece of paper, and basically had drawn like a series of boxes on it, which didn't look very flash at all. And he's like, "Look at that!" And he basically just explained his vision, and from there he sort of said, "I think we can do something." Now, in a way, to kind of give it a little bit more context, usually my dad has a million one different ideas, and he's got a few friends that he would often take these ideas to. And usually the ideas he'd take would either defy physics or defy logic in all general terms. So usually his ideas are kind of not realistic. But in this one, he went to an engineering friend who certainly could understand how to create an technology from scratch like this. So he took his idea and he basically said, "This is one of those ideas that maybe we can do something with." So,
wow. So, you know, we live in a world now of algorithms, of kind of numbers. And for me, what that translates into is like people use that, you know, they measure and they define success on measurements. You know, we do it all the time with our social media, you know, and I think in our current world, we would all agree that it's not being useful, it's not being helpful, it's actually hurting us a little bit. We're already very competitive, and it's pushing us into more of a competitive space, you know, where we go after these likes and stuff. Now, I guess one thing I'm interested in is trying to work out how we blend, you know, something like a dream and why. How do we measure those things? You know, like what were you measuring in the time when your dad said, "Hey, let's give this a go"? Because I feel like that's how all things kind of start. You know, they start with this idea of a dream or a vision or or something like that, and then we have to try and work out how to articulate that in these numbers. Right. You know, and I think we do it for a lot. Now you add in, say, culture, for example, and you have this kind of interesting fusion. And I see it particularly in our world today, and a lot of the guests I'm connecting with on the podcast, they operate in a kind of space just outside algorithms, where it's culture-based, where it's feeling-based. Would you say that you kind of went into that thing with your dad with that understanding?
Absolutely. I'd say, well, you know, if we go back to where we come from, it certainly isn't very difficult to find an empty car parking space. So there was no kind of rationale within our local environment to justify creating a company like that. And then when we kind of trying to piece back to where maybe this idea emerged from outside of the dream, as you could try to do when you reflect backwards, the only kind of thing I could come to terms with was because he'd done a bit of traveling and sort of had an experience of the rest of the world and been to quite large cities like London or Los Angeles and places like that, where obviously there's a lot more pressure on land. So perhaps that was something that, you know, we could try to rationalize, but I think overall it was an intuitive decision to kind of say, there's something there that maybe we should explore.
That intuitive decision is an interesting one, and I think a lot of people in today's world are not quite sure what to do with intuition. You know, I think about it all the time. You know, like let's say meeting someone, it's all intuition. Yeah, I mean, it's not if you go down the route of online dating. It's all algorithm. But if you kind of met someone at a pub or, you know, at a barbecue, which is where I met my wife, it's all intuition, and it always feels like your intuition's wrong.
Yeah, sure.
You know, like I had no idea that Moni, my wife, was even remotely interested, because my intuition was all, I don't know, giving me mixed signals, and so I sometimes sit back and I think, well, in our measured world, in our algorithm world, how do you measure things like love? And I think we're trying. You know, if you think of the kids now, they're trying to be given guidelines and rules.
Absolutely, yep.
But I sometimes wonder if it's not good.
Well, it's interesting that you kind of say that, because more recently I've become quite interested in yoga sciences. So not just yoga in terms of our Western understanding of the flexibility and the health aspects of that, but more of a philosophy for how life works. And so within what I've understood from part of this journey is yoga talks about different aspects of the mind, and how the mind is actually separate of the body and of the brain, and they don't actually recognize the brain as being part of a separate entity in and of itself. Whereas in science, we're kind of spending a lot of energy and time and effort to really understand how the brain works. But in yoga, they're saying the brain is actually just part of the body, right? Like the heart and the liver and the kidney. It has a very important piece to play, a very important part to play, but overall it's just one component, right? So really we need to understand the whole system to grasp what's happening there. So when we think about intuition, and we maybe draw back into what our Western education has taught us, it's really taught us to sharpen only one aspect of the mind,
Right.
which is, as I understand in yoga, it's the buddhi, which is our intellect. And the intellect is meant to be sharp. So that's why we go through school and we're sharpening it all the time. But then we kind of try to use our intellect to kind of stitch things together, but we can't really stitch things with a knife, right?
True that.
Yeah, because,
So I guess the thing is that I think about, because I totally agree with what you're saying. I mean, I agree with it in terms of I can start processing what you're saying, even if I'm not implementing all those things into my life. Is sometimes I think, what do we do about that?
Right.
What do we do about that? And I wonder if maybe what we're both up to, even like in this scenario now, like for me this represents something very different. I sometimes think, who else would sit in a car park and try and pull this off,
right?
You know, and like it's recorded and there's video and there's audio and I wonder what I'm trying to simulate. You know, what am I reaching out for? Is it that I'm looking for difference? Is it that I'm looking to challenge myself? Because I think with sometimes things like meditation and exercise and yoga, they become buzzwords that people associate with, and sometimes associate incorrectly.
Right.
You know, I heard someone today say, "Oh, I meditate when I lie down and go to sleep," and the person said, "Well, that's actually different because you're meditating and being focused on that to progress something, to be in that exact moment." As opposed to when you're lying down and going to sleep, all that's turning off, all that's shutting down, so you can, but they seem the same.
Yep.
You know, and that's the kind of confusing part, and that's why I like kind of sticking on these points and just churning them over.
Sure.
What exactly do we mean? How do we incorporate this into our lives? Do we do it unconsciously? Because that's why I brought this up. What am I unconsciously doing?
Right.
Am I unconsciously, being in an uncomfortable zone, but I'm not giving it that label?
Yeah, sure. And I guess, just to kind of drop back to this yoga term where we're focusing a lot on the intellect, right? So we're using our logic to kind of rationalize why we might be doing something that, if it exists on a subconscious level, like it doesn't quite it can't be articulated, right? Because it's something that's not in our current awareness. So we're awake at this stage and we can kind of see what's going on around us, but we don't really understand what's happening outside of this current awareness, right? So the intellect is it playing out, trying to dissect why we're doing stuff, but for what reason? Is it only just dissecting it down to something that it's no longer what it is? I think the analogy is like a flower. right? You take a flower, you can use your intellect to dissect it. But as soon as you cut it, it's no longer a flower, right? It becomes the components of the flower. So when we have maybe these ideas and we have these experiences, we try to cut it. It's no longer the experience or the idea, right?
Gotcha. Who is in your circle of people? Are you all thinking like this? Like, because one of the things I feel is that, or one of the things I ask myself to feel is, am I the majority of people who are questioning things, looking to not be towing the line all the time?
Sure.
Like I deeply believe in following the law, but I don't deeply believe in just aimlessly following trends and ideas.
Sure.
And maybe that's what I'm doing again with the van and all of this stuff is trying to not, trying to take this thing and make it into something new. And I wonder if we're all like that, or if there has to be experiences in your life which draw that out, or if that it's some type of magical plan where a certain amount of people will be funny, a certain amount of people will be awesome at maths, a certain amount of people will be awesome at everything, and some people won't be awesome at anything.
Right.
But we all have to, and maybe we are all that.
Right.
And we all have a spectrum of that,
Yeah, well, once again, in the yogic sciences and tradition, it talks about yoga meaning unity and union. So if we appreciate it in that sense, then everything is all a part of us. Now, that's something that can't really draw down and articulate in the rational sense, because it exists kind of outside of our awareness to a certain degree. However, in my circle, I've got a group of really close mates that are sort of on a similar journey, and they've been doing a lot of things like meditating and fasting, and looking inwardly through I guess a spiritual seeking kind of journey. I think my dad's been a huge influence as well. I remember growing up, he would have this yoga book, and he'd practice yoga in the lounge when we'd be asleep in the weekend. On the Sunday morning, he'd be there and doing headstands and stuff, and I'd and I'd be like, "What are you doing?" And he's like,
"How'd that go down in Tokoro?"
Oh, I don't think anyone else knew about it, but at the time I guess he was just doing that.
Why is he like that?
I don't know. I think even coming back to your question of like, are there only some of us that do some of these things, or are there others and we do different? We have a focus on certain attributes or talents. I think part of why he's like that is that he's just had a series of experiences that have informed him of something else that he should explore. I think that's probably part of it.
Okay, well, let's just take a pause for a sec. Remind ourselves where we are. We are in my podcast van. It's probably a little bit too small. Are you feeling all right?
I'm feeling good, bro.
I mean, apart from the fact that I'm looking for security, and I saw one dude kind of looking in, and I felt like they're going to call, what's the police where the armed defender squad? Like, there's some dudes in the back.
It does kind of feel like this is like the blacklist, and you might be taking me somewhere soon. But I don't know.
But I mean, overall, probably the lights are a bit too bright and our exposure's a bit up. But I kind of feel like it's a good challenge.
Yeah, we're good. Yeah, I think we're good.
When you talk about the future, and you go back to the bio and futurist, they caught my eye. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, that's a good question, bro. What it means to me is somebody that has a interest in what the future might look like. Not so much that I'm interested in predicting it, but that I'm interested in participating and creating it. So I think I look to what's currently a focus in technology and I guess society overall, and sort of look at where these opportunities might place us. So futurism is kind of this concept around art in science fiction, and to a degree of what possibilities might be, whereas futurology is more of a scientific approach to understanding trends and looking at patterns that are emerging, right? So there's a handful of people around the world that are doing some pretty awesome things, particularly around neuroscience and epigenetics. But for me, my interest is really around education and enterprise. So I mentioned earlier that I started entrepreneurship, and my journey was about 15 years ago. And I can see it as a pathway particularly for our Indigenous people to kind of utilize their skills and talents to add real value to the world. And that's sort of an area where I think we can play a huge part in the future if we start to kind of pull together and collaborate.
And so, do you kind of mean like taking the old ways of thinking and kind of bringing them into the future? Do you kind of mean like, we reference yoga a few times in the podcast, there must be something in the Pacific realm, because we talk about philosophers and philosophy, and sometimes, being half Cook Island, I sometimes wonder, well, who are the Cook Island philosophers?
Right.
And what were their versions of Stoicism, and why don't we talk about that?
Right.
It's not that I don't want to, it's that it's easier to find history with James Cook and all of those things as opposed to the other story, the other narratives.
Absolutely.
The Pacific and Māori people who were travelling the world as well. Is that what you're interested in? So the future, I'm just trying to get an idea, because you referenced two ways of thinking about the future. One being the kind of algorithm side, the measurement side, and the other, what was the other?
So our Indigenous sort of knowledge and talents that we can draw upon. So you're kind of what you're alluding to, and I think it's a combination of both. I think,
is that what that futurist means to you? That the combination of both?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, and I guess that's whether we look backwards to utilize that kind of Indigenous knowledge that has always existed, but has probably been I guess to a large degree suppressed or kept under wraps. But I guess even now we can look at some really good examples like Rangi Matamua with his work around maramataka and lunar cycles, and that kind of stuff is now starting to become more in the mainstream, whereas it was held by people that were charged with looking after that type of knowledge in the past, right? But now with social media and so forth, we can basically access a lot of that remotely. So I think we do need to look backwards a little bit. However, it's also taking stock of these things that are kind of coming at us really quickly. We talk about artificial intelligence or even some of these technologies that are people like Elon Musk are working on for Neuralink, or even SpaceX as an idea. He wants to somewhat save humanity by sending us to Mars. But I think we should be really asking the question is, okay, if there's people like him that are creating that, do we just sit back and let it happen, or do we actually say, wait a minute, there's some stuff in here that I'm not so comfortable about putting a chip in my brain at this point of time, but
bro,
I know that's pretty out of it.
It's interesting to think that is on the horizon.
Yep.
And it's interesting to think that might create another divide between, let's say, you can process the mind faster. Well, if history is anything to go by, it's not going to be the most vulnerable who get first in, first serve. And then what's the black market of that going to be? And you know what I mean? Yeah,
but I also think we're going to miss out on the opportunity to really, take a better understanding of what was learned in the past. If we talk about yoga as just an idea, or even in New Zealand we have a lot of Mātauranga Māori knowledge, that's really powerful and helpful, that perhaps if we're going towards the technology side of implanting things into our bodies, which are not so much natural, that we won't have that opportunity to kind of understand to a larger degree what this vessel is, or what this vehicle can do.
So true. What's also interesting is as people just walk past looking, what's also interesting is the fact that we'll just take a moment, push through it.
Yeah, go for it.
What's also interesting, bro, is that a lot of the technology is kind of driven to keep us comfortable, to keep us out of the uncomfortable zone.
Yeah, sure.
And the more you look through ideas, the more you kind of realize that things have to be a bit uncomfortable so that we can learn from that. And you have it today. You have like Professor Jonathan Haidt researching how just horrible social media has been on our kids because of what it brings out of that the caveman brain. It takes away all of our evolution or goodwill, and it just pits ideas against each other, and it shows you what the difference is. And I guess what I'm a bit worried about is technology is going to make it too easy for us and then make us even more vulnerable than we realize.
Right.
Because it feels quite safe. I mean, it definitely feels safe enough for me and you to sit in a random car park.
Yeah, sure.
And to know that we could probably say sorry, talk our way out of it.
Yeah.
Not that we would be in any real danger.
Right.
But who knows? Maybe we are.
Yeah, I think we're pretty fortunate to be in the middle of Auckland here and not some other city around the world. But it's certainly something to think about, man. I don't have any answer to that.
No. It's not like I don't want to put you on the spot. It's more just these ideas. And I wonder if that's what we're doing. I wonder if that's why we've kind of connected.
Yep.
Because I certainly get the feeling that part of my role is to bring my mixed cultures, and to bring my the technology that I've learned over the years, and to help people share their own ideas.
Right.
Because I don't know, there seems to be two thoughts in my mind, and one is we're just cluttering by sharing more.
Yep.
And that it was the job of the broadcaster and the scientists to really think about it before they speak. Now me and you, we can just speak, and we don't really have to take any negatives from it, because we could just be two people speaking.
Sure.
I wonder what you think about our roles as leveraging technology to put ideas out there, and a certain level of probably bravery that needs to come with that, right?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think we just live in such interesting times where we have the opportunity to do things like this. I mean, I think 5-10 years ago, we didn't even really have an awareness of podcasting as such here in New Zealand. But now we can kind of just give things a go, and I think we're best suited to try things. So Auckland is quite a safe place. We're not going to necessarily be arrested or hijacked or kidnapped or anything like that.
If we were hijacked, though, we'd be because we're both pretty much stuck in here. I think you're safe though, eh?
Yeah. I think we'll be alright.
What's floating your boat, bro, at the moment? Like, what are you following at the moment that you'd like people to also follow? Because that's the thing. Like, we're probably going to do a few podcasts over the years, and I hope it's less question answer. It's more just us talking and working things out, because that's the type of podcast I want. I don't want to get into the zone where we have to be the answer people.
Right.
I just want our ancestors' hard work to get us to this point. Whatever they did allowed us to negotiate a way that we could sit here in the back of a van. Like, that's right. That I do think of that. I think, what would my great grandmother or grandfather think?
Right.
They're like, whoa, you could have done anything. And that's what you chose to put your time into.
Sure.
But so I'm sharing that, and I'm sharing that publicly, and I want to do this as an ongoing conversation. But what's floating your boat in terms of ideas that maybe people should be checking out, or people, philosophies?
So I guess one of the big question marks I have at the moment is around like this aspect of consciousness. What is consciousness, right? And I know science has a really hard time in trying to define that, because for various reasons it's very complicated, and but within that we look to the future. In 10 years time, I think most people can appreciate that the world's going to look completely different to what it is now. AI is a real thing, and it's coming quickly. It may not necessarily look like Skynet or Terminator, which is a good thing, but it certainly is going to either make our life a lot easier, which maybe we're not going to take so many risks going forward, or it's going to enable us to do things outside of the safety zone a bit more, because we won't have to worry about taking care of the mundane things. However, with this technology, there's still like a massive range of levels in which we look at the world, which I think could be problematic. Maybe that kind of points back down to our individual identities and who we say we are and who we say we're not.
Yeah.
I think there's a big question mark to ask around, what is this consciousness thing, and is there a way in which we can level our collective consciousness up so that not too many people get left behind in the future?
Well, it's a nice segue because we are doing our own podcast together called Cultivating Consciousness.
Yep.
And it's a deep one.
Yep.
You sent me some notes the other day and I was like, you mean business. And
Sorry about that, bro.
I just wanted to do the dad jokes and, try and derail it. But I'm excited about the prospect of trying to never figure out answers, but trying to go there.
Sure.
Go on the journey and enjoy that journey,
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm excited by that too. And it's not to say that you and I have answers for this kind of aspect of what we're going to talk about, but I'd like to put it out there that we want to cultivate consciousness for ourselves and for others that have an interest on being more inclusive and thinking about how do we win this human race.
Yeah, bro. Whew, big stuff. Huw, what's a moment that blew your mind? What's a moment that changed your perspective on life, that helped you see through a different lens? Do you have one of those that you're okay sharing?
Oh, that's a big question too, bro.
Your reaction is not different to
yeah,
others.
sure. It's kind of, I have this, I don't know if it's a wall, a barrier, or like this block in which thinking back to the past isn't too easy anymore. I found that like parts of my memory aren't all that reliable. But if I can kind of remember a time, it was probably when I was about 16 years old and was seeing my dad come home from work, and he basically said that he'd had to hand in his resignation, which my dad at the time, this was before he kind of got into his startup, but so it was about 16 and he came home and basically said he had to resign. The opportunity that he had wasn't going to allow him to continue moving upwards in the organization, so he said, you know what, may as well just take some form of redundancy and try to do something a bit differently. Because I guess throughout his life, he'd kind of dropped out of school when he was about 14, 15, and so he never got through education, but he certainly wanted to challenge himself. So if I think about that kind of moment, it was a bit of a catalyst. That's trying to a catalyst to support the idea that it's okay to give things a go that aren't necessarily normal, or sort of not what people within our current circle would do.
I think that's exciting because what I'm imagining is people will hear that and it will give them permission subconsciously.
Cool.
Or plant the seed, that it's okay to do things a bit different.
Absolutely.
I sometimes think like the law, for all of its bad PR, it's been thought about for a long time,
right,
and tweaked. So it pretty much guides you. You can do a lot within it.
Oh, for sure.
Like this.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a lot of areas where you can play around the edges.
Right.
And they're the fun areas. It's fun. And I'm hearing a helicopter and I feel like it's
for sure.
SWAT coming because it is pretty dodgy. But it would be a funny story, hopefully, if we're not put in Guantanamo. Huw, I want to thank you, bro, for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
I look forward to carrying on this journey with you and to go deep and for us to hopefully offer value however we can and however culture is asking us to, because I feel like there's something happening.
Yep.
I feel like that's not a surprise that the 2 podcasts I've done this week are with people with mixed cultures.
Sure.
I feel like there's not a surprise that the more we push out traditional religion, the more we have to replace it with other deep ideas.
Sure.
That I think we're exploring.
Cool.
And that's an interesting one because people don't think of yoga in the same way as Christianity.
Sure.
But they're both old as.
Yeah, very.
And
very
they
much.
both have things that are probably good and bad if you dig deep enough.
Sure.
But I just want to be exploring and opening us all up to lots of ideas, and even ones where you get accused of contributing to the problems.
Right.
I said that to you when we first met. I'm worried that I'll say something wrong that is not my intent, but happens to line up with the wrong way of thinking.
Right.
And we know in this world that you can be scolded for that.
Sure.
So what is also giving me bravery is knowing that I have other people along for the journey, and that it's that it's about sometimes siding with unpopular views. You know?
Yeah, cool. And like just on top of that, bro, I'd just say as long as you're like from the few times that I've met you now, I know that this is where you're coming from, and that you're coming from a place of love anyway, so you're not out there intentionally trying to hurt anybody or offend anyone. So look, bro, I think let's just do this. All
right. Cultivating Consciousness coming soon. Maybe if you're listening to this down in the future, it's already out, so hopefully you're a fan. But we will find a way to do a bit of a launch of that. Yep. All right. We're going to wrap it up here, and we're going to move into recording an episode of Cultivating Consciousness. Thanks, brother.
Thank you.
Boom. That's the end of that episode. I hope you enjoyed listening to Huw as much as I did. I want to thank Huw for joining me on the podcast. It's one of many conversations that we will have. And what a privilege it really is to be meeting people and talking and thinking, even for you listening right now. Like, the creative juices are flowing, the mind is thinking, the body is reacting, and that is an awesome place. So awesome. Let's end it on that note. I hope everyone's doing as good as they can for the day. And remember what I said at the beginning, because I'm trying to live like this. It's a long game, and I want to play that game. So it's a long game, and we're playing it, and you have to want to play it. So let's play the game. Let's live life, and let's blow our minds. All right, team. See you in the next episode of Please Blow My Mind.